Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name's Megsy, and today I'm going to be doing a different kind of video that I have seen floating around booktube. This is a video, not really a tag video, but I have seen other creators do it. More recently, Emily Fox. I will link her video down below, although she did not originate the video, but it is going over your most read authors whose bibliography you have read the most of. And so I started thinking back on my most read authors, and they are all here in all of these books behind me. I don't own every single one of the books anymore because I have limited space, and I guess I used to not believe in libraries. Anyway, today I will be going over my top 7 most read authors. And the kicker is that most of these authors I don't really have a desire to read from again, or like read more of their work. I kind of got burnt out, or my tastes have just evolved. So yeah, let's talk about it. And if you're interested in any of the authors that are listed down below, maybe it can help you get into reading them and tell you what books to start out with, what is their best, what books to avoid or not waste your time with. And yeah, if you're interested, please stick around and we will get started. The first most read author I have, which should not be a surprise to anyone who knows me, is Joyce Carol Oates. I have read 21 of her published works. This includes 14 novels, 5 short story collections, and 2 novellas. I'm also not even including excerpts of her nonfiction I had to read in grad school, but that doesn't count. And I have a decent amount of her books. I owned all of those books, those 14 at one point, 21 at one point, and I've given away the ones that I didn't care for, that were just mediocre, but I still have all of these. So let's go over this stack of Miss Oates's work. All right, so looking at this vantage point, please excuse the cord. I'm gonna try to bring forth some of her best and summarize what Joyce Carol Oates is even about, because she is a very prolific author. She has won numerous awards, but I don't feel she's really talked about that much on BookTube, and I'm not quite sure why. She's a hugely influential writer to me, not just as a reader, but also a writer. And I think if you're looking at her work, you'll be like, well, where do I really even begin? Now, my personal taste is that I don't really care for her earlier works. I don't really find myself gravitating to the stuff that she published in the 60s and 70s, nor do I find myself gravitating towards her later works like post 2010, 2009. I feel she kind of got sloppy, and then I also feel like her earlier stuff, she didn't really have like a specific voice and style that I recognize. I think that her like peak Oates to me is stuff that she published in the 80s, 90s, and the aughts. So I have talked about my favorite work of hers, and I think was my actual first novel, which is Blonde, which very widely known because it is a sort of mythical reimagining of Marilyn Monroe's life. It is quite large, but I think it is truly captivating and really encapsulates the old Hollywood studio system and how terrifying it was to be a contract player, specifically a woman at that time. And then other works of hers that I think were personal favorites were The Gravedigger's Daughter. This came out in 2007, and it is loosely based on a reimagined life of her grandmother, who the family fled Nazi Germany. They were German Jews, and they settled in upstate New York. And the father of the family commits this horrible act of violence against the family. And all of these secrets are something that the protagonist kind of tries to avoid as, you know, she's living her life and surviving as an adult. But I thought this was really compelling and really well done. Again, I read it many years ago. And then another work of hers that I really loved, novel, was, I think I read it twice in my 20s, was I'll Take You There, which is like another coming of age story about a young woman in college in the 60s. And she is white and she ends up in an interracial relationship with a black student. I read this so long ago, but I just remember really enjoying it and kind of had a little bit of like a dark academia vibe before that was even like a known genre. And then in terms of her short story collections, the two I want to highlight as being outstanding were I Am No One You Know. This came out in 2004, and Faithless, Tales of Transgression, which came out in 2001. I Am No One You Know has, there's actually a 9/11 story in here about a woman living in downtown Manhattan during the 9/11 attacks, and I thought it was really well done. And I still kind of remember the stories in this. I mean, she always has not strong, but like complex, nuanced female protagonists that aren't flat and one-dimensional. And I think that, I mean, now I feel like there's so many more women writers writing complex female characters, but I felt like, for me, I didn't really think that was like, I don't remember that being as widespread in the 2000s in terms of the publishing world as it is now. And so if you want to like look at like female rage or messy female characters, but that aren't like, don't have the trappings of the typical millennial girl novel, like millennial fiction. And I mean, I like a lot of like millennial kinds of female writers that write about those things, but sometimes it can get a little bit like repetitive or whatever. And so I do recommend Oates if you are interested in complex, nuanced female characters. A couple other works by hers I want to highlight are Foxfire, Confessions of a Girl Gang. This was turned into a movie in the 90s starring Angelina Jolie. And let's see. Oh, I don't really remember this one so well, but also because it is bitter and because it is my heart, I love the title. It's actually paraphrased from a poem by, I don't remember his name, I'll have to look it up, but a lot of Oates' stuff is quite dark, and there was always this undercurrent of violence, whether it is more overt or sort of simmering underneath the surface. So yeah, I don't know if her later works are that particularly great or compelling, but I do recommend all of the books I mentioned if you are interested in her and want to start reading her. The next most read author I have is Margaret Atwood. I have read a total of 10 Margaret Atwood works. Most of them are here, except for like 2 or 3. I have read 6 novels, 2 short story collections, 1 poetry collection, and 1 nonfiction piece by her. All right, where do I begin with Margaret Atwood? I was interested in Margaret Atwood before this, but in undergrad I did end up doing my thesis on her works and like the feminist themes within her works. She is most known for The Handmaid's Tale, which I actually no longer own. It's one of the 2 or 3 I gave away. I think that book, to me, kind of why I didn't really enjoy it so much, I mean, other than the fact that, yeah, it is disturbing and kind of hits close to home, is that with dystopian novels, I sometimes feel that there is so much invested in world building and sort of like ominous warnings to the reader that sometimes the characters themselves suffer from a lack of characterization or memorable personalities. I guess that's kind of how I felt with the book, that it was also quite bleak in a way that kind of felt like it was beating you over the head a little bit too much with the points she was making. But her other stuff I do enjoy. Again, probably I gravitated to her because she had strong female protagonists, complex, nuanced characters. And so I am trying to recall the first work of hers I read. I think it was The Blind Assassin. And I'm pretty sure that it was the beautiful cover of this sort of looks like a 1930s film starlet that got me. I don't really remember this. It's quite long. I actually do want to reread it this year. I do plan to reread this. It is 520 some pages, I think. And I know it contains a novel within a novel, and there is like a science fiction element to it. That is the common thing with Margaret Atwood's works, is that she does have like she does do speculative fiction, obviously. And The Blind Assassin and The Handmaid's Tale are not her only works that incorporate this. It is interesting that she's not really seen as science fiction because she is literary. Like, again, these like, so she's known as speculative, and it is weird. It's sort of these weird boundaries of genre. But she is a great writer. I've talked about Cat's Eye. This was a very meaningful book to me about a woman's life, an artist's life, and childhood trauma in the form of bullying and how that affects her throughout her life. I used to have a collection of her poetry, but then I gave it away. I don't know, I wasn't like particularly captivated by her poetry. I feel like people aren't aware that she does write poetry. And then I do have a nonfiction piece by her on writing, Negotiating with the Dead, a writer on writing. Why do I feel like a lot of these super prolific writers like Stephen King and Atwood, and I think Oates did this too, like publish meta narratives about writing? If you're into kind of like domestic fiction, feminist issues, although Atwood's a little bit more, her feminist range is a little more limited, right? It's not like when you're reading Atwood, you're going to get a perspective like an Alice Walker or a Toni Morrison, right? Because she is like an older white Canadian woman. So, she came out of the second wave of feminism. But for me, at that point in my life, I did really like her stuff, and she is a very talented, prolific writer. So in terms of her best works, where you want to start, I mean, I guess read The Handmaid's Tale, obviously, because it is an iconic book, then turned into an also very popular TV show. But I would recommend Cat's Eye. I would recommend, I don't remember this, but I feel like I'm going to like it, The Blind Assassin. She is just someone that I really have to go back and reread if I want to. But I just think she should be known for more than just The Handmaid's Tale. I think that work is so overhyped in comparison to her other works. The next author who I have read the most from, I honestly can't even believe this when I was thinking back and creating this list, but it is none other than Philip Roth. I've read 8 of his novels. And that's kind of a lot for someone that I said I had, in an earlier video, a love-hate relationship with. I don't have all his works anymore. I got rid of some of them. I think I got rid of 3. But yeah, these are the ones I own. So, I kind of think that there's a couple Oates, oh my god, what author am I on? Roth works that are worth reading, and then there's some that are just, don't bother. There's a certain limit to his works because once you've read one or two, if you've read enough of his novels, you start to see kind of common settings and characters and themes that are kind of done over and over again, which I don't think is really uncommon for most authors. A lot of people are writing to an extent of what they know. And so a lot of his works take from his own life in terms of being a young Jewish American man growing up in the 50s in Newark, New Jersey. So many of his works take place in Newark, New Jersey. And there is always like an obsession with sex and sexual politics in a lot of different ways, in ways that aren't always, I mean, people have said Roth was like a misogynist, and yeah, don't bother reading Portnoy's Complaint. It's a shitty novel. I don't really think it's that good. And there's other stuff by him I have no desire to read. But I do want to talk about the stuff that is worth reading. So his 2 most interesting novels, I think were the most experimental, are The Plot Against America and Operation Shylock. So The Plot Against America, this came out in 2004. It is an alternate history, also speculative, that is about the 1940 election, and instead of FDR winning re-election, it is Charles Lindbergh, who was actually a Nazi sympathizer and wanted to make peace with Nazi Germany and campaigned on like an isolationist platform. And so this is what happens if he actually ran and won the election. And I mean, it's weird because there's a lot of parallels to the 2016 election. I read this like not that long after the 2016 election, and it was pretty uncanny. And this came out in 2004. The only thing with this book, though, is that the ending is very Deus Ex Machina, which I didn't really think was great. But it is pretty interesting to see all of these different historical parallels, and I thought it was pretty well done in terms of concocting an alternate history that is somewhat based in reality. And then Operation Shylock, wow, I don't even know where to begin with this. Naomi Klein references this book a lot in her recent work, Doppelganger. It is indeed about doubles. And the one thing with Roth, which, I mean, he was kind of a narcissist, was he literally would like have alter egos in his piece. One was a character called Nathan Zuckerman or something. But in this work, it's actually Philip Roth, the novelist, is like a double. Like, he's in this work. He's trying to make it seem like it's almost nonfiction, even though it's not. Like, it's a kind of meta-narrative. And there's this man named Philip Roth who's impersonating him, who is in Israel, and he's preaching reverse Zionism and saying that like all the Israelis who are European, who are Ashkenazi, should go back to Europe. And that's the only way that like they will achieve peace. And Roth is very much incensed by this person spouting this and using his name and image. And then he goes there to find this man. I kind of think that this book was Roth's own way of trying to reconcile with his liberal labor Zionist upbringing. There are things in this book that the character Philip Roth says, the doppelganger, and also a Palestinian character who's a lot of people said was based on Edward Said, that are very, very progressive for the time period in which it was written. This was published in 1993, I think. And I was kind of shocked that this, I mean, maybe it did, I didn't really look into this, caused more controversy than it did when it came out. Because if you would read this, you'd be like, okay, Philip Roth. I don't really want to get into it. I also feel like YouTube is like weird with like censoring if you talk about anything like pro-Palestine, whatever. But of course, Roth, he had this tendency to have characters sprout these very long opinions that were often political that you can kind of think might be his opinions, but he would hide behind those characters. He did that in American Pastoral, which is, okay, it's another very famous work of his, but I kind of prefer the movie a little bit because the movie cuts down on the monologue-ness of it. And I always kind of find American Pastoral had some similarities to I Married a Communist. Do you know what I mean? At a certain point, you read a decent amount of his works and you see a lot of stories kind of being like similar, parallel storylines being regurgitated. So not regurgitated, but definite similarities. I just think there's a certain number of stuff of his that is worthwhile, but overall I wouldn't really like say he's an author you need to read every single thing he published. So my next most read author I have read 6 works of, and that is Mary Gaitskill. I have read 3 short story collections by her and 3 novels. I have reviewed some of her stuff before on this channel. So Mary Gaitskill, where do I begin? Mary Gaitskill, she came out in the late 80s publishing works, and a lot of her stuff deals with sort of transgressive topics of like people who are kind of outcasts in society. She wrote a lot about relationships that had BDSM aspects to them, sort of like the underground art scene of both New York City in the 80s and 90s, as well as Ann Arbor, Michigan, which I believe is where she is from. So I think it's interesting. Again, I don't feel she's talked about too much on BookTube in terms of being a really good contributor to the sort of sad girl, complex, messy woman narrative, but not quite as flat and one-dimensional. Like, if you like Tessa Moshfegh or Shavisa Woods or Melissa Broder even, I feel like you would like Mary Gaitskill. She's not, like, though, as gross with bodily fluids as Moshfegh or Broder are, but her most well-known is probably the short story collection Bad Behavior, which was the first book of hers, short story collection I read, which was published in 1988, the year I was born. And the movie Secretary was based on the story in this book. It is very, very different, the short story is actually about a woman who is sexually harassed at a law firm. And the movie, they turned it into like a kinky rom-com, which was not at all what the short story was about. I just think she's really good at writing also about sort of like these characters with these sort of transgressive lives, but also like mundane situations that seem mundane and minute, but there's always like a lot going on underneath the surface, if you know what I mean. I do think she is a better short story writer than a novelist. I've not been a huge fan of her novels. Like, some I'm like, okay, they're fine. But there's none that I was like really blown away by. I feel like they sometimes feel too padded out, and her written form is just better in a short, succinct short story. So yes, I have Don't Cry, which I recently reread last year. I thought it was really good, and it made me really fall in love with her work all over again. I have Because They Wanted To, another short story collection. And as I mentioned, Bad Behavior. I also have the novel Veronica. And this was on like the New York Times Best Books of the 21st Century, which I was kind of surprised by because I don't really remember this that well. I mean, maybe I should reread it. Her first novel, Two Girls, One Fat and One Thin, I don't think it's very good. It was her debut novel. So I feel like you could skip that one. And then I did read and review last year, as well as in my review of Don't Cry, The Mayor, which I think that came out in 2015. That was very different from what she normally writes because it was about a young girl in upstate New York who is, you know, in this sort of program where inner city kids are working with horses. If you want to get into Gaitskill, I highly recommend her short story collections. I wouldn't say that you should go with her novels necessarily. I think she is a master of the short story. And also sort of the master of like being one of those early pioneers of writing about sort of like weird, transgressive, sad women moving type of stories, but not done in a way that feels sort of like a millennial. I mean, she's obviously not a millennial, but sort of what kind of now feels like a standard millennial trope in literature. So yeah, I will say of the authors I have reviewed so far in this list, she is still someone I do really like and do actually want to like reread some of her stuff. The next author I have that is my most read is also an author whose I have read 6 of their works. I'm also kind of embarrassed about this, but whatever. It is Jacqueline Susann, who wrote Valley of the Dolls. And I only currently own one of her novels because I got rid of all the others. So Valley of the Dolls, as I said, is her most well-known. I read it when I was 17 and I loved it. And then I was just like, I have to read every single thing she ever published. And I think a lot of her stuff we had to order, especially from Borders, because it wasn't even like in stock at the store. I got rid of all of her stuff except for this because I did reread this recently because I didn't really have an urge to reread Valley of the Dolls because I felt like it really just wasn't well written. I mean, yes, I liked a lot of what she wrote about was show business in the 40s, 50s, 60s. So show business or Hollywood or the television industry, because she herself, Susann, did traveled to New York City. She lived in there. She was an aspiring actress, and it didn't work out. And then she went into writing. And so she wrote a lot about, like, women in show business and how they were treated. But a lot of her works also deal with love and men and women's romantic relationships and the power dynamics at play, and stuff that was actually pretty progressive for the time period in which she was writing in the 60s and 70s. And she also wrote, like, frankly, about, like, addictions too, because she was around all that stuff in show business. I have talked about Once Is Not Enough on this channel, and I did actually like it. It is quite like a weird 70s whirlwind of stuff, but if you love the unhinged female character trope and you want something that is an older work, read this. I think it will not disappoint. And again, if you kind of like the works of, like, a Melissa Broder vibe, I think you would like Jacqueline Susann. But again, the only one of hers I can say that is really worthwhile is Once Is Not Enough, and that was, I think, her last completed novel before she died. If you want to read Valley of the Dolls because it is iconic, then go ahead. It's not really the best written thing, but that's Jacqueline Susann. The next author, we're going to get into number 5s. In the home stretch here is Vladimir Nabokov. I have read 5 of his works, and I have 1, 2, 3. Yes, I have all 5 here still. I also DNF'd one that would have been 6. If I read it, it was called Ada or Adore, something like Ada Desire or something. It was very long and boring, and I did not finish that. I have reread Lolita once as a teen. Excuse me, you want to come over? Harley wants to get in the shot. Hi. Harley says, pay attention to me. Don't burp on me. I know. Thank you. Thank you. Do you want to say hi? Do you want to say hi to the camera? No. Okay. Okay. So, Lolita by Nabokov. Yes, I have read this. It is actually, it's not pornographic. I just want people to know that. And understanding Nabokov's works as to, and his mind as to, like, why he would write such a thing. I have read that he was possibly sexually abused, people think, by his uncle as a young boy. And that I've read somewhere else that Lolita, earlier drafts of this were actually about Lolita was actually a boy. And the editor or publisher made him change it, which is interesting. But I do, he was a beautiful writer. Like, there was no doubt, like, he knew how to craft a sentence. Just, he was very intelligent, and so he uses a lot of very unfamiliar vocabulary, I think. And then I have 4 of his other works. I have Despair, Glory, Invitation to a Beheading, and Laughter in the Dark. I read these so long ago, I don't really remember them that well. I mean, I don't know if they're really, I don't know if they hit as hard as Lolita. They were good, I just don't remember them. So he is an author that I read him, I burned myself out on his stuff. I'm sure when I read him, I didn't really understand what I was reading because I read him when I was like 20, like 19, 20. So I think he is an author where I would probably enjoy his stuff the second time around, now that I'm older, now that I feel like I'm just, like, a better reader in general, because I'm more inclined to, like, understand what I'm reading as opposed to just reading words and not having them fully absorb. And then, like I said, I did read Lolita the second time around, and I still did enjoy it. So, yeah, that is Vladimir Nabokov. And then the last and final author I will be discussing in this collection, Isabelle Allende. I have read also 5 of her works. Fun fact, Isabelle Allende was related to Salvador Allende, the democratically elected socialist leader of Chile who was couped by the CIA and Pinochet. So I did have a phase, probably in my mid-20s, where I read a lot of Isabelle Allende. She primarily writes historical fiction, and again, sort of focusing on strong female protagonists, complex women characters. And a lot of times her stuff does have like romance as a subplot. That is definitely present in The Japanese Lover. And I think it's a Daughter of Fortune, or is it Portrait in Sepia? I don't know. These two were actually kind of like linked. And I feel like that is like the most I've ever come close to reading something that is romance, if you know what I mean. But it's just like the romance is not like the only thing at stake, right? I have also read her memoir, Paula, which was about her daughter dying. And I hate to say this because it is a memoir about something very, very tragic and horrible. And her daughter died when she was only 29, but it was kind of boring. Sorry. No disrespect to her, and then also a fiction novel she wrote that was very much based on, I think, her second husband's life, The Infinite Plan, or he was like a street kid in LA, and I didn't really enjoy that because I found him kind of annoying. So yeah, I haven't really read any more of her stuff, and I don't like specifically feel compelled to. I mean, maybe I will at some point, but she's just not really high on my list, and it's not to say that she's a bad writer. She's not, by any means. I haven't read House of Spirits, which is like her most well-known, I think, and I know there's other stuff by her too. That's it. Those are my most read authors, which is such kind of an interesting mix, but kind of not. There are a lot of parallels here. But yeah, let me know in the comments below who your most read authors are, if you can think about it. And if you would read or have read any works, more than one, by any of the authors that were mentioned in this video. And yeah, please comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.